How did you hear about climate change? Maybe you learnt a bit about it in school, read a book or a news article perhaps. Or in recent years, you saw the TV news, a documentary or a film. But it's hard to comprehend the level of such a crisis, when for most of us living here in the UK, there aren't many visible effects that we can see and feel around us. In the digital age we're living in, we learn most of the news from the mainstream media. But what impact does that have on our perception of climate change? Public opinion of climate change has evolved drastically over time, fueled by troubling representations in the media. We've come a long way from the days of climate debates arguing is there or isn't there climate change, to now images of our burning planet accompanied by the rallying cry of climate activists calling for action on what's now suitably branded a crisis. Now we see media hype all over our screens. Talk of protests, political summits, documentaries led by famous faces. But what's all this hype really telling us about climate change? Artist René Magritte's painting, The Treachery of Images, depicts a pipe above a line in French that reads, "This is not a pipe," highlighting that images can only ever provide a representation of the truth, and not necessarily the truth itself. So it follows that everything we see on our screens is merely a representation of climate change, painted by the artists of the mainstream media. And so our public understanding of climate change is actively constructed through the screen.
Well, I think the media is really important in terms of communicating environmental messages, but I don't think they tend to do it very well. I think a good example, most media news covers the topics in a very sort of shallow way, and I don't think necessarily always communicate the importance of big issues like climate change or the need to take action.
The news never goes into depth enough about why it's so important that we need to be tackling climate change, how it affects us here, and what people can do about it. Just taking another example like plastic pollution, people's understanding of that over the last few years, probably since Blue Planet 2, which really highlighted it, has gone up massively.
Mainstream media news is clearly lacking something when it comes to reporting climate change. But perhaps broadcasters make up for this in their nature and wildlife programming, which have in recent years, led by the famous voice of David Attenborough, focused more on the environmental damage to our planet that's made it less resilient to warming temperatures. But what do these programmes tell us about climate change at a local level?
The Green Centre specialises in education, One Planet Living education, and also run a zero waste programme and a whole bunch of other things, projects around reuse. It was quite funny when David Attenborough did the documentaries, Blue Planet I think it was. It was very much about marine life and the impact of plastic on marine life. So really raised awareness of the damage that plastic was doing across the world. So that's great. And it was quite phenomenal, really, as to how much that impacted the general public. And people started getting quite vocal about plastic and demanding to know why we weren't doing more about plastic in Brighton and Hove, etc., without actually fully understanding the actual issues. So in actual fact, that was quite a damaging thing in the media and really made our work twice as hard.
So there's obviously been a significant gap between global and local issues in these documentary series. So what are the missing pieces that they're failing to represent?
I think that many nature documentaries do tend to, and particularly David Attenborough's documentaries are famous obviously for their cinematography and the way in which they frame shots. It's just incredible. And they serve a purpose in that I think they capture the public imagination. I think the downside of them is that somehow they imagine this planet that doesn't have people on it. And that is, to my mind, a missed opportunity.
So I think a lot of the documentaries that are out there often focus on far-flung places that a lot of people will never go to. And it's very difficult then for people to relate that to themselves and to see how maybe that's affecting them, but also how they're affecting the environment as well.
You know, obviously people have an interest in the world's environment and its species and habitats. And I don't think necessarily that documentary approach speaks to people about the environment that is local to them. And actually I think it's important to do it because that's what engages people on that pathway to stewardship. That's what gets people active, either as an individual or collectively.
After decades of filming various series around the globe, the BBC finally brought us a primetime Attenborough documentary series focusing on the British Isles. First broadcast in April of this year, Wild Isles brought us spectacular scenes of our stunning landscapes here in the UK and highlighted several challenges facing our environments and wildlife.
I think it's come around a little bit in quite interesting ways when his attention has now turned to Britain, because so much of our landscape is actually produced by humans in very obvious ways. So the one that I've seen most recently was the one around grasslands, and how grasslands support a huge sort of diversity of nature, and yet they are an ecosystem that's been created by humans, animals, plants over time in a particular way. I think had he had some of that work been done in other parts of the world with that also in mind, that might have been a little bit better.
We saw a shift in Wild Isles, from focusing on faraway lands to now bringing our local nature and the ways in which it's been shaped to light. But what about climate change and the ways that's been shaped?
It's a great example. It's highlighting sort of local issues and national issues, but it's not really looking at the causes, or it's not looking at the causes in any detail. And I think that's probably a missed opportunity with the programme.
I think where they stop short is in terms of anything that drills down into the causes, like why we're where we are. To me, that's the big area that's not really ever spoken about. And if anything is evaded.
Yeah, I think in the documentaries they don't often focus on the causes of climate change. I'm trying to think of examples even where they've done that. They maybe mention that it's to do with CO2 emissions, but not really in depth, like who are the main culprits, you know, it's massive industries, but they never really touch on that. I'm like, why not? I'd love to ask them. In the last episode of Wild Isles, when they go into I can't remember what they called it now, but it was the one that they didn't show on the BBC, but did show on iPlayer. And they did go a little bit into, only one thing that I can remember is the seagrass, and they mentioned a few of the things that had caused our loss and degradation of seagrass. And then they did actually go into one project that was helping to restore seagrass beds. But that's like the only example that I can think of.
The final episode of Wild Isles featured voices not heard before on climate change and our environment. Passionate voices of people working actively in their communities to restore their environments. Voices of farmers promoting regenerative forms of agriculture that work with nature. Voices from marginalised communities. Voices of people of colour and voices of children that were never broadcast. The BBC argued that the episode, commissioned by the RSPB, WWF and National Trust, was never intended for broadcast and instead hidden away in iPlayer's extras for those who wanted to watch it. But why? And what picture are they painting of climate change when these voices are left out?
I think one of the issues of not mentioning the causes or going into much detail about the causes of climate change issues in documentaries is that it's then difficult to talk about the solutions.
I think one of the things that the BBC has done differently has been with Spring Watch and Autumn Watch, which have really been about helping people understand biodiversity on your doorstep and some of the issues around urbanisation that perhaps are damaging to those environments and to those natures. But potentially the issue with that is seen as somehow not to do with climate.
You know, I think people are alive to the nature crisis and the need to recover nature, but often they don't make the connection between that and climate change itself. And obviously a lot of the solutions we're looking at involve restoring nature too. I mentioned nature-based solutions. Well, often, you know, adapting to climate change and taking carbon out the air requires planting trees and creating habitats and wetlands, and so actually there's potential win-wins in terms of recovering nature but also adapting our landscape to climate.
Through our modern day lifestyles, we've become disconnected from nature. But nature and climate change are intrinsically linked, not only in the ways it'll impact us, but also in the form of new opportunities and ways we can address our shared crisis. We need the media to make these links, so that we can start seeing these conversations in the mainstream.
I think in nature documentaries there is a sense in which the shots are framed in such a way that the emphasis is very much on the wild and the wilderness and people as not being part of that, as somehow we're separate to that nature. But what's kind of a sad thing in a way is that those documentaries don't pause to reflect on, by choosing the way to present, they are framing a very particular sort of view. So I think maybe a missing piece is that actually very important part of nature, which is the human species, but also to sort of break that down a little bit and to look at different kinds of people living in different kinds of ways in various parts of the world, whose relationship with nature is very different, and for people to understand that our view of nature is actually quite narrow and possibly part of our undoing, or has been part of our undoing when it comes to climate change.
I think the problem with kind of only filming the sort of spectacular, wild-looking places that we have left in the UK, it kind of leads almost to an othering of it, because people might not necessarily see that. Well, most people definitely don't see that in their day-to-day lives. But, you know, in reality, nature is all around us. It might be degraded and urbanised, but it is still there. And I think trying to make that link is really important to help people feel connected to nature. If people are connected to nature, they're more likely to protect it.
I've been running the Green Centre for 17 years, and I haven't really, if I'm being honest, seen significant behaviour change. People like recycling, but the other issues, which are, in my view, more important, don't really get much of a look in. And so it's almost a distraction for people. It feels good to be able to bring something to somebody and go, right, you can do something with it, recycle it, make it into a new material, etc. But it's only a tiny, tiny, tiny part of the entire agenda.
So I think people's understandings of care for nature is in some ways not helped by these documentaries, because they're packaged and commoditised in that way, that somehow that then dispels the sense of you being a part of it, that it's there as something for you to consume rather than something that actually you're part of and you should be caring for.
As humans, we may have out-evolved every other species on our planet, but we're still part of nature and the wider ecosystem, and we'll all be impacted by climate change in some way. There's a desperate need to adapt our lifestyles to help mitigate climate issues. But is that reflected in mainstream media representation of climate change?
The mainstream media raises a lot of issues. For example, plastic recycling, plastic being shipped abroad, they do raise the issues. There's no doubt about that, and it's really important to raise the issues. But what it does, it leaves the general public anxious, angry, but what it doesn't provide is what do we need to do about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a risk with an hours of programming, seeking to be engaging and entertaining. There's always a risk that you cover the issues in a very sort of shallow way, and people are then left wondering, well, what can I actually do as a follow-up to that?
They never really go into much detail about what you as an individual can do to help, whether that's signing petitions to get better legislation in place that will protect nature.
Perhaps he's effectively sidestepping the politics, but I think it's also a way of not taking responsibility. So those political questions could be brought in better, and the ways in which nature and people are interconnected needs to be there a little bit more front and centre.
The BBC's failure to represent these interconnections raises the important question of why. And who are they benefiting by not bringing these political questions into the frame of their mainstream programming?
So yeah, I think these documentaries that show this very sort of cinematic, beautiful version of wildlife that we have here, obviously it's amazing, I love those documentaries, but they do kind of skirt around the systems in this country that have created those problems. Fisheries management, for example, and having more marine protected areas. It has been announced that there's 3 areas around the UK that will have this kind of gold standard of designation, in that it's completely closed to any extractive or damaging activity, and they're called highly protected marine areas. It's amazing, we've got one in Sussex. It was recommended to the government in a report last year that there should have been 5, but they've gone with 3. So that's disappointing. Obviously, we're very excited that there's going to be one in Sussex, but in the grand scheme of things, we need more. And I don't think these documentaries ever really talk about that kind of thing. And possibly that's to do with BBC's impartiality, rules or whatever, which is just a massive shame, because it really is a missed opportunity to try and get people on side and to take action.
I think the word impartial when used to media is really problematic, because there's no such thing as impartiality when it comes to talking about something like climate change, and particularly the causes of climate change or the underlying structures that mean that this kind of climate damage continues to happen. I think there is a very misplaced understanding about balance and how you can actually start to really explain those interconnections in a way without having to somehow have a climate denier pop up or somebody from the oil and gas industry pop up and give the opposing view. That strikes me as being actually somewhat immoral for something from a so-called public service broadcaster. There's not a lot of service going on there. In a way, not enough is being done to move us towards thinking about some bigger changes in society. The most interesting example for me is this continual talk about economic growth. Like, economic growth is something that is sort of unchallengeable, it's something that everyone agrees needs to happen. And yet, if you continue to grow the economy in its current trajectory, then all that's going to happen is increased pressure on the climate. But somehow those are some disconnected from questions about nature, and nature documentaries don't go there. So lots of those sorts of issues get buried, and again, the dots are not being joined up. I think one of the reasons why the media steers away from these is because they then get tangled up with all sorts of critiques of capitalism, critiques of that are seen as something from the far left, rather than something that perhaps needs to happen for sort of species survival.
As a public service broadcaster, the BBC has a responsibility to represent the truth about climate change. And yet so often they leave out the crucial questions that need to be answered.
And I think what's an interesting question is, about the sorts of dilemmas that people making these programmes are facing. And it's sort of like, what room for manoeuvre do they have within the political economy of the BBC, how it works, or how any of the other broadcasters work.
In recent months, questions have been raised over the BBC's tendency to curb more critical opinions by keeping them out of the mainstream, or in some cases attempting to silence them altogether. And often when critical voices are brought into the frame, they're branded as too disruptive and extreme. You don't have to look far within the BBC to find strong indications of where their loyalties lie, and it doesn't appear to be with us. With roles in the BBC due to shift in coming months, there's a need to look closer at their relationship with the government and whose interest they're serving when it comes to mainstream climate discourse. As a society, we need a fundamental shift in the way that we think about nature and our environment. And the media should be leading this shift in order to more effectively represent the ever-growing crisis that is climate change.